Please tell me you didn't actually invite him, someone hissed near the altar as a murmur rippled through the church. The bride broke into a run, her white gown trailing behind her as she crossed the aisle to embrace the man stepping through the doors. He stood alone in the entrance, clothes worn thin, hair a cloud of gray. Guests shifted in their seats, some whispering, others looking away. But just moments later, the room would fall silent as 12 U.S. Marines marched in, shoulders square, uniforms immaculate, and raised their hands in a collective salute to the woman who had once offered kindness without question. Emily Warren's days began before the sun. By 4:30 a.m., she was already rolling dough at Morning Bell Bakery in San Diego, sleeves dusted with flour and her radio humming quietly in the background. At 30, she had carved out a name for herself, not just for her impossibly flaky croissants or her cinnamon rolls that seemed to melt on the tongue, but for a small ritual that never wavered. Each morning, just after her first batch came out of the oven, Emily would wrap one pastry with care, fill a to-go cup with black coffee, and slip out the back door. A few blocks away, she'd leave them on a bench near the bus stop, along with a small handwritten note, "Wishing you peace today." She never lingered. She never spoke. The man who received her gift, an older black man with a solemn gaze and weathered skin, was already seated there by the time she arrived. He never asked for help, never made eye contact with passing strangers. He just sat, quiet, like a figure carved into the rhythm of the city. And for 6 years, they shared this silent exchange. No introductions, no questions. Just a morning offering between two people who never named each other. Her co-workers had long formed their opinions. "That's real smart," one muttered once, rolling her eyes. "Wasting bakery goods on someone who probably doesn't even remember it the next day." Another had scoffed, "Kindness is cute until he turns on her." Watch. It's coming. 3 months earlier, new management had taken over. During her first performance review under the new supervisor, Emily heard the inevitable. "I respect the heart," he began, tone clinical, "but a few regulars feel uncomfortable. Have you considered supporting a local shelter instead?" Emily had nodded, lips tight, but made no changes. She simply started arriving earlier, 15 minutes before anyone else, leaving the food before anyone could notice. She thought it was working, until last week. A new hire had returned from her break early and caught sight of Emily slipping back in, empty-handed and flushed from the morning air. The next morning, her voice rang out behind the counter, loud enough for customers to hear. "She's been feeding that guy at the bus stop for like 5 years. Every single." Day A customer nearby leaned in, whispering, "Poor girl. Thinks she's changing the world one muffin at a time." Emily didn't flinch. She kept kneading the dough, the same way she always had, but the sting was real. Not because their words cut her pride, but because they missed everything. They didn't see the man's quiet dignity, the way he held the cup in both hands like it was something rare. They didn't see the stillness in him, or the fact that in 6 years, he'd never asked for a thing. They saw a problem. She saw a person, and she wasn't about to unsee him now. "You've always been too soft," her mother had said, half serious, half affectionate, when Emily told her about the engagement. Marco, a firefighter, understood Emily's quiet generosity, because he lived the same way. He never walked past a broken taillight without stopping to help, never let a meal go untouched if someone else was hungry. "You both," her mother continued with a shake of her head, "give away what you earn like it's air." But Emily knew what they didn't. Giving wasn't about getting back. It wasn't a tally or a virtue signal. It was about seeing what others refused to look at. And she had seen him. Victor. Not that she'd ever known his name, not yet. For years, their connection had been stitched together through quiet nods and brief, fleeting glances. There were no conversations, no expectations. Just a ritual carried out on the sidewalk before sunrise, consistent as breath. Until one morning, under the gray churn of a December sky, she noticed something different. He was trembling. Rain swept sideways in the wind, and he sat huddled beneath the overhang, shoulders hunched, coat soaked through. Emily didn't hesitate. She unwrapped the wool scarf from her neck, fraying at the edges but still warm, and placed it on the bench beside his breakfast. Their eyes met, and for once, she didn't look away. The next morning, the napkin that usually held her note had something scrawled on the back. The pencil lines were shaky but deliberate. "Thank you for seeing me." She folded the note carefully, slid it into her wallet, and carried it with her like a secret weapon against indifference. On long days when the world felt callous or cold, she'd take it out and read it quietly, and somehow, it always helped her stand a little taller. As the wedding approached, Emily ordered her cake from the bakery she'd devoted herself to for 6 years. She invited everyone: co-workers, neighbors, the coffee shop owner down the street. Marco teased her for wanting a guest list that looked more like a block party. "You're trying to fit the whole city into one pew," he said, grinning. But he never questioned it. He knew her heart, and it was one of the many reasons he loved her. 2 days before the ceremony, an unmarked envelope arrived at the reception venue. It was addressed simply, "To the bride." No return address. Inside was a neatly written card. "Tomorrow I will come. Not for cake, but to repay a debt." No signature. The wedding planner raised an eyebrow. Emily reread the message, her thumb brushing over the ink. She wasn't sure why, but something about the handwriting made her pause. A curve in the letters, the restraint in the line. She couldn't place it, but it felt familiar. On the morning of her wedding, Emily stood at the window of the bridal room, her nerves buzzing. Outside, the guests had begun to gather. Family in tailored suits, friends adjusting corsages, co-workers smiling beneath the sun. Then she saw him. At the far end of the church steps stood the man from the bench, no longer wrapped in layers of weather-worn cloth, but in a faded, well-kept suit. His shoes were polished, even if the soles looked worn. His silver hair, once unruly, was combed back with care, and for the first time in all the years she'd seen him from a distance, Emily saw his face fully, etched with loss, aged by experience, but standing with dignity, not defeat. The whispers had already begun, but Emily had stopped listening. She didn't see a guest out of place. She saw the man who never asked, never expected, but always showed up. And now, he had come again. He stood still at the entrance, upright despite the years carved into his frame, his posture carrying the same quiet strength Emily had witnessed all those mornings on the bench. But now, wrapped in a faded suit and a silence deeper than the church's marble walls, he was drawing attention, for all the wrong reasons. Emily could hear the whispers slip through the partially cracked door of the bridal room. "Is that the homeless guy from downtown? Please don't tell me she actually invited him. Is he here for food? At a wedding?" Her chest tightened. Their voices weren't loud, but they didn't need to be. She recognized the sound of judgment when it slipped from polite mouths, and suddenly, all the careful planning, the seating chart, the string quartet, the flowers flown in from Baja, melted away under the heat of something far more important. She didn't wait for protocol. Emily lifted her gown in both hands and moved fast, her satin heels tapping across the foyer's polished floor. Gasps followed her. Her wedding planner's voice chased behind, calling her name in confusion. But Emily didn't slow down. She reached him just as he was about to step aside, perhaps preparing to leave. Her arms wrapped around him tightly before he could vanish into the margins again. Her face buried against his shoulder, makeup forgotten. "I remember your eyes," she whispered, emotion crackling in her voice. "The very first time, 2017. You nodded and I couldn't even speak." His arms came around her slowly, cautiously, then fully. A quiet smile spread across his face, and something in him straightened, not from pride, but from relief. "Every single morning," he said gently. "You treated me like a man, like I mattered." Emily stepped back just enough to look up at him. "You always did." She slid her arm through his, her head held high, and turned back toward the church. Near the doors, her wedding planner hurried forward, flustered. "Emily, the ceremony's starting. Who is—" But before she could finish, the air shifted. A sharp sound of vehicles braking outside drew every head toward the entrance. The tall double doors creaked, then burst open, this time not with drama, but precision. 12 U.S. Marines stepped inside in full-dress blues. Every eye in the sanctuary turned toward them. Their formation was flawless. Their shoes gleamed. White gloves gripped ceremonial hats. Their faces were carved in discipline and reverence. Someone gasped. A champagne flute slipped from a table, the shatter echoing like a bell. A murmur, then silence. The lead Marine stepped forward, Captain Duncan, his name glinting from his lapel. He came to attention, heels clicking together with military precision, and saluted the bride without hesitation. Then he spoke. "On behalf of Alpha Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines," he said, voice deep and clear, "we are here today to honor the woman who gave quiet strength to a forgotten warrior, for 6 years, without fail, and without ever asking for his name." Emily's hand, still resting on Victor's arm, trembled. Guests turned in their seats, unsure what to believe, as Duncan turned his body slightly and gestured toward the man beside her. The man they had dismissed, whispered about. The man they had failed to see. "This is Sergeant Victor Hale," Captain Duncan announced, his voice echoing under the vaulted ceiling, calm but weighted. United States Marine. In 2004, during a deadly ambush in Fallujah, he saved 9 lives, dragging his brothers out, one by one, under heavy enemy fire. A stunned silence blanketed the pews. Duncan paused, his eyes settling on the man beside Emily. In 2016, after losing his wife and daughter in a car accident, Sergeant Hale vanished. He never used his military benefits, never spoke of his record, never revealed his name. He disappeared. By choice. Around the room, guests shifted in their seats, their earlier whispers caught in their throats. Some lowered their eyes, others blinked, stunned. What they had dismissed as a wedding disruption was, in truth, the re-emergence of a man who had risked everything, for people he no longer had the strength to face. Another Marine stepped forward from the formation, cradling a wooden shadow box lined with velvet. Inside it lay a tarnished medal and a faded photograph. The image showed a younger Victor Hale, his uniform streaked with dust and blood, carrying a wounded soldier across a rubble-strewn street. Behind him, barely visible in the background, was a younger Captain Duncan, barely recognizable except for the sharpness in his eyes. "Sergeant Hale carried me 4 blocks, Duncan continued, his voice growing more raw. "I had taken shrapnel in both legs. He was wounded too, but he went back for 8 more. That action earned him the Silver Star, a medal he never claimed." He dipped his head briefly in reverence, then turned to the crowd again. "If not for him, I wouldn't be here today," he said. "And if not for you, Ms. Warren," his voice softened, "he might never have survived to see this day either." Emily could no longer hold back the flood. Tears streamed down her face, dark streaks trailing through her carefully applied makeup. Her grip on Victor's arm tightened as she looked at him through new eyes, eyes that finally understood the weight he had carried in silence. "I didn't know," she whispered. Victor's voice was low but steady. "That was the point," he said, eyes forward. "I didn't want gratitude. Not for doing what I swore to do. After my family, I couldn't stand being called a hero, not when I'd failed them." He faltered just a moment, the tremble in his jaw betraying a sliver of grief. Then he straightened. "But you," he said, meeting her gaze, "you never asked for my name. You didn't want a story. You just brought food. You brought dignity." He exhaled slowly, voice now thick with quiet emotion. "Those notes, your presence, they gave me something to wake up for. You reminded me I still existed." The Marines moved again, quietly forming a ceremonial line, 12 men in a corridor of honor from the sanctuary doors to the altar. Their faces were stoic, yet reverent. Captain Duncan turned toward the guests, who now sat frozen in a reverent hush. "Ms. Warren didn't know she was feeding a decorated war hero," he said. "She simply chose to care for a man who looked forgotten. Day after day, year after year. No recognition. No audience." His eyes swept slowly across the room, pausing on the faces that had just moments ago whispered with judgment. In the Corps, he finished, we say, never leave a Marine behind. But sometimes, it's civilians who live that better than we do. He turned to Emily. And sometimes, the people who never wore the uniform teach us what service really means. One of the bridesmaids stepped forward, cheeks streaked with tears. I work with Emily at the bakery, she said, her voice trembling. She gets in early just to bake extra, out of her own pocket, so he'd have something warm every morning. She never said a word. Not once. Another co-worker stood beside her, eyes down. We used to tease her, she admitted quietly, shame tightening her throat. We thought she was being naive. Turns out, she was doing more than any of us. A man near the back of the church rose slowly. This isn't just a wedding, he said, voice cracking. This is a ceremony of honor. At the center of it all, Victor turned to Emily. His hands, rough, scarred, but steady, reached for hers. I don't have much left to give, he said softly. But I brought the only thing that's mine to offer, my truth and my thanks. His gaze held hers, steady and sincere. I knew you were getting married. Heard you mention it once at the counter, when you didn't think I was listening. I hope it was all right, that I reached out to a few old friends. Emily's smile broke through her tears, radiant despite the emotional storm she was standing in. This is the most beautiful gift I've ever received, she said. You being here, all of this, it's everything. Marco, who had been watching it unfold with reverent awe, finally stepped forward. He extended his hand toward Victor. Sir, he said with quiet conviction, it would be an honor if you walked her down the aisle. Victor blinked, stunned. But Emily was already nodding, her arm looping through his once more. Her face turned toward the sanctuary, where the Marines had resumed their line. This moment, unplanned, unscripted, was no longer just hers. It belonged to everyone who'd once been unseen. After their honeymoon, Emily never returned to the bakery. She and Marco took the monetary gifts from their wedding and put it towards something small but purposeful, a quiet breakfast program for homeless veterans in their neighborhood. They called it the Quiet Table. There were no announcements, no glossy flyers or staged photos, just a modest wooden sign etched by hand. Feeding one person feeds an entire life. Victor never returned in person. But each month without fail, Emily received a postcard from a different city: Atlanta, Tulsa, Sacramento. Each one said the same thing in his deliberate, looping handwriting. Every breakfast is a salute. Thank you, Emily. Captain Duncan would later explain that Victor had finally applied for his VA benefits. He was receiving treatment. Housing had been arranged. The Corps had helped him reconnect with the community he'd once walked away from. He wasn't hiding anymore. On the first anniversary of their wedding, Emily and Marco arrived at the Quiet Table before sunrise. But they weren't alone. All 12 Marines stood waiting, no longer in uniform, but in jeans and jackets, each holding a single white flower. We'll be rotating shifts here, Duncan said simply. This legacy, it's not going to be forgotten. What had started with one woman's simple act of morning kindness had blossomed into something no one could have predicted. Veterans from all over San Diego began visiting the Quiet Table. No names were required, no explanations. Just warm food, quiet dignity, and the assurance that someone saw them. Someone still cared. Someone had once noticed a man on a bench and decided he mattered. Above the counter at the Quiet Table, framed behind a pane of glass, hung the napkin. The ink was faint now, smudged slightly at the edges, but the words remained legible, steady, and unforgettable. Thank you for seeing me as a person. Victor Hale. Beneath it, Emily had added her own inscription, carved into the wood in simple block letters. Everyone who sits at this table has a story worth knowing. 6 months later, a local news crew got wind of the place. They arrived with cameras, lights, and clipboards, ready to document the sudden rise of a kindness movement. Emily met them at the door, polite but firm. I'm not the story, she said gently. The veterans are. When pressed for a quote, She only smiled and pointed toward the row of tables. "It's about seeing the invisible," she said. "That's all." On mornings when the food ran low or the volunteers called out, when exhaustion lingered like smoke in the air, Emily would pause, just for a moment, and remember her wedding day. She'd see those 12 Marines standing tall at the church doors, saluting not her ceremony, but a habit no one had ever clapped for. That image stayed with her. It reminded her why she kept showing up. Marco understood without needing to ask. As a firefighter, he knew that heroism didn't always come with sirens or headlines. Sometimes it looked like cinnamon rolls at sunrise. Sometimes it was just not looking away. "You know," he said one evening as they wiped down the last table, "when I married you, I didn't just gain a wife. I got 12 Marines, and a growing family I never expected." Emily laughed through tired eyes. "The best kind of family," she said. "The kind you choose, and the kind that chooses you back." Victor never returned in person after the wedding, but his presence never really left. Each month, a postcard arrived, sometimes from Louisiana, sometimes Arizona, once even from Anchorage. Always the same message, written in his neat, deliberate hand. "Every breakfast is a salute. Thank you, Emily." Captain Duncan told her that Victor was healing, finally using his benefits, attending trauma counseling, and rejoining the military community he once believed had no space for grief. The ripple had grown. More veterans found their way to the quiet table, not just for food, but for something harder to name. Quiet respect. A place where no one asked what went wrong. No one required them to explain who they used to be. The meal was enough. And Victor's note? It had become more than a memory. It was a mission statement. Emily often looked out over the people seated at those weathered tables, men and women whose eyes carried the weight of stories untold, and thought of all the strangers the world passed by. A person on the sidewalk might be a former teacher. A woman asking for change might have once been a nurse. And sometimes, the quietest figure on a bench had once carried lives through a battlefield, silently enduring what others couldn't imagine. Hardship never erased identity. Pain didn't cancel legacy. Kindness didn't need an audience. And heroes? Sometimes they wore dress blues. Sometimes they wore aprons. But often, they wore nothing at all. Just a weathered coat, a fraying scarf, and a need to be seen. Because not everyone who deserves a salute wears a medal. Sometimes the ones guarding freedom are just waiting for breakfast beneath a bakery awning. And the greatest acts of courage? They often go unseen.